All right, guys. I'm Nicolette, and today Brian and I are back here with our friend Michael Knight over at Exponential Technology Group. That's new, so you'll be hearing a lot about that in the near future, as well as still from our TTI friends. So we're happy to have Michael Knight join us. Actually, this is our third year to talk about the year ahead and what we're seeing in electronics, and hopefully we'll touch on some solutions, and we usually have a pretty hopeful and optimistic conversation. So we're excited to have you back with us, Michael. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I look forward to this every year. It gives me, I think by now you guys know that for whatever perverse reason, I don't mind sticking my neck out. And so far, you haven't chopped it off. So hopefully this will be a repeat.
Well, honestly, we need more people like you in this world that are willing to stick their necks out,
Yeah. So I guess I want to get started with looking at 2021. I mean, I know that's a large a large pill to swallow, but I mean, let's take a look at the past year, and then we'd like to touch on some of the confidence and consumer buying and a lot of those shortages. So, in your opinion, Michael, what does the year look like, and was it what you had envisioned when 2021 began?
Yeah, so my one-word answer on 2021, cluster. What a cluster, right? But it actually unfolded exactly as here at TTI we expected. And to really get a kind of running start on 2021, you got to go back into middle of 2020. When we had that big COVID dip in the first quarter. And by the second quarter, the industry was coming out of it. By the third quarter, we were making up lost ground and developing ahead of steam going into 2021. And, based on kind of historical patterns and really what I think we were doing going into 2021 that kind of set us up for the cluster that the year became, was waiting for the other shoe to drop. So, the key theme on all of this is demand has been growing. It's been growing in basically all technologies and in all end market segments. And on top of that, what's been happening is there's been actually some new market segments that have really caught fire and are adding to the pressure, the demand pressure on the whole supply chain. So, things like electric vehicles are really coming into their own, medical wearables. It's, AI is consuming more and more compute power. There's a ton of IoT applications that are emerging, especially the remote stuff that's battery enabled, is really catching fire. So, the long and short of it is we've got this really pervasive, quickly expanding demand on the supply chain. And what's made this year so difficult and dominated the headlines is that the supply chain has not been up to the task. So, I think the big question as we start talking about next year is what's going to be different. But to wrap up on this year, despite all of that, despite the pandemic, despite the ongoing tariff wars, despite the ongoing, ever-escalating climate-related disruptions, like the big freeze that we had here in Texas in February, which, by the way, we're still in a way digging out from under that. It got the fabs that Cypress and Samsung have here horribly behind. It's taken a long time for them. I'm not even sure that they're completely caught up yet. And as an aside, the weatherman here in Texas is saying we might have another one. And my guess is we're no better prepared for it today than we were in February earlier this year. So, you take all that into account, and it's been just hell on the supply chain. Despite all of that, when the year is over and we start, calculating numbers, comparing numbers, it's gonna be mind blowing. In my business, I'll give you a couple of real data points. Mauser Electronics, which is, obviously I'm biased, but I think it is the best component support mechanism for the design engineering community, is going to finish the year 50% ahead of where they were last year. And their number last year was a pretty damn big number. So, to put 50% on that's, when do you ever see that? The rest of the TTI business is going to be up anywhere from, 20 to 30%. The stuff that I'm directly responsible for is going to be up over 30% year on year. That's just astounding. By the way, we also had the growth last year. So this is growth on top of what happened last year. And I don't think these numbers are at all unique to us. I think these are the kinds of growth numbers that the industry experienced in 2021, despite the uneven supply of parts and everything else that we're dealing with. So that's the year. This is one for the record books.
Well, you mentioned supply. When you look at the shortages we've had over the past year, what is your prediction for 2022? Do we see that subsiding at all? Is that impacting consumer confidence? How is that working?
Yeah. So, and here's where the news gets mixed. There's plenty of sources that will say that things are going to normalize next year. By the way, most of those news sources were saying that things were going to normalize in the second half of this year. So I guess the first question is, if they got it wrong on a shorter time horizon, what's the chances of them getting it right on a longer time horizon? But and then I think there's mounting evidence and a growing number of voices saying that this thing is going to be a cluster in 2022 as well. You have, everybody from, the CEO of Intel to Matt Johnson, the CEO of Marvell, the guy at TSMC, et cetera, talking about on the semiconductor side, there's going to be a shortage of chips straight through this year and probably well into next year. And now, all of that has to get parsed. So if we just spend a second talking about the semiconductor side of it, because that is the thing, obviously, that's kind of in the public's mind. You think about this, pre-pandemic, I would guess that the vast majority of the public wasn't aware of semiconductors and didn't understand things like fabless or foundry, had never heard of TSMC, right? And now, it's funny, through the pandemic, we've all become kind of amateur epidemiologists, talk with apparent expertise about the vaccine and the virus and all of that. And I think we're also become kind of amateur supply chain experts.
Yeah.
And talk about it, supply chain. So as it applies to our industry, electronics, starting with semiconductors, to get around to answering your question, Nicolette, is it ain't getting better in 2022. There might be an easing of pressure, but the fact of the matter is, so here's some hard data points. A new state-of-the-art fab is about $15 billion, and it takes, at this point, a couple, if not several years to set up and provision. Right. And that's well underway. The CapEx spending for semiconductor companies this year, I think is going to finish about 146 billion. So that's a massive number, and that's up more than 30% on the CapEx spending last year, and up, I think, more than 50% on CapEx spending in 2019. So first, the good news is the CapEx spending for capacity expansion is accelerating. I mean, that 146 billion is more than twice what was spent historically, even as short a time ago as 5 years, right? So that's the good news. But the other side of that coin is the costs of fabs are going up dramatically as well. And so that's part of it. And then what you have to do is look underneath that to understand what's being invested in. So, here's the punchline. We're spending money on the newest process node technology, 5 nanometers or smaller. And the vast majority of that in terms of wafer capacity expansion is targeted at 300 millimeter wafers, not at 150 millimeter wafers, not at 200 millimeter wafers, not at legacy process nodes like 28 nanometers, which, by the way, is where a lot of the chips that go into automobiles or even that go into IoT come from. And so I saw, I don't remember where I saw this. I saw something that said for every $6 being invested in semiconductor capacity expansion, less than $1 of it is earmarked for the legacy technologies. So what that means is that isn't ever getting better. The only way that eases is if demand falls off. Right. So, in this kind of ties to being able to develop some understanding of confidence, and that, and this is a supply chain observation that I've had for a while. I tell you what is happening in 2021 and is going to continue to happen has a lot to do with what I think is kind of a tough love approach to the supply chain that the suppliers have taken, whether they're doing it deliberately or with that kind of concept in mind or not. It's what's happening. So one of the reasons you've seen such lift in revenues this year is because price increases have been pervasive. Mm-hmm. Now, some of those price increases are obviously in reaction to the rising cost of all the inputs. If we talk about labor, raw materials, energy, transportation, et cetera. I mean, that's all real, and it's getting priced in to the finished components, and then, of course, getting priced into finished goods that we as consumers are after. But some of it goes well beyond that. So, the reasons for that is, in some cases, especially outside of semiconductors, the margins have gotten squeezed down to the point where it's just not economical to add capacity at anything more than a trickle rate. Right. And so I think it's been very important for the entire supply chain to get margins up so that it does make sense to kind of increase your investment if you're a component manufacturer. But the other piece, and this is the tough love piece of it, is quite frankly, I think price increases are happening as a way to uncover real demand. Mm. So, all the speculative buying, I think the industry has done a great job of curbing that by pricing it such that it's pretty painful if you get it wrong. Mm-hmm. So I've seen a lot of evidence of this, especially in the second half of the year, is we start to pass along price increases. We do see customers starting to adjust their backlog to really just what they know they need, as opposed to a safety factor, because the safety factor has a price attached to it that on the backside of this cycle, and there will be a backside of this cycle, we're all going to be sitting on parts or committed to incoming parts that are at an historically high price point. That if history teaches us anything, there will be some fallback, right? The price will retreat a bit. And actually, if history teaches anything, the price is going to retreat a lot. Now, I don't think actually that history going forward is as good a predictor of the future as it has been. Which also means I don't think the price rollbacks are going to be anything like what we've seen in the past. But nonetheless, it's with that mindset that people are planning their purchases. I mean, and not to belabor this, and I'll shut up here in a second. We're seeing, so our book to bills in my business have been running 2 or better. 2 to 1 all year. And it's not slowing down as the year starts to come to an end. When you normally would start to see a slowdown, it's not. We're booking business for 2023, and I'm seeing orders come in with 2024 delivery dates.
So do you think, I mean, we already had the shortages going on, right? Do you think with all these that, with these prices, the price changes and things like that, do we think some of those smaller companies, small electronics companies and manufacturers are going to start failing? Like, what's the prediction there? If they're overbuying and the price retreats, right? Are they going to wind up being in,
at a disadvantage?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. And there's some really good insight there in that. So the short answer is absolutely. I mean, right? It's kind of a common sense thing. And so specifically, I'm personally seeing a growing number of examples of this. And what I'm talking about is smaller companies, startups who have not secured their place in the supply chain hierarchy, via their tenure or via their purchasing strength, are getting deprioritized. And how's that for a friendly way of saying screwed? It makes sense, right? When you have finite capacity and the demand exceeds your capacity, first companies you're going to take care of are your biggest customers that you have the most history with, right? And then next, you're going to take care of are customers that are big, but that your competitor has history with, and you're going to look for an opportunity to jump in and get yourself established. And when it's all that's covered, anything you have left, you earmark for the up and comers. Personally, I think this is very short-sighted in that, in the up and comers are the next Medtronic, the next Apple, et cetera, right? But when you're chasing numbers, especially when you're a public company, the logic is, you can't argue with the logic. So to your question, Brian, yes, there are going to be casualties as a result of this, because if you're a company who does not have a lot of power or leverage in the supply chain, and or does not have has been kind of cavalier about your relationships, hopping from one supplier to the next based on who's got the best price, kind of approaching the supply chain as it's just one big free-for-all auction, you're going to get deprioritized. And of course, it only takes, missing one part that is hard to find or sole sourced for you not to be able to make your product, which means you can't ship product to your customer, which means you have no revenue.
Right.
This is and we are very proactively talking about this, especially from my friends at Mauser with the supplier community, that, hey, let's make sure that we have some piece of capacity reserved for the small up and comers, the unforecasted demand associated with new product design, so that we don't miss a design cycle or inadvertently give this phenomenal underlying growth trend that I see tons of evidence for a haircut, or worse, a buzz cut, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, the other thing you mentioned earlier was Fabs, right? And we talked about ramping up Fabs, especially in the U.S. And I know you mentioned in your talk a few months ago about Intel and Arizona. And I know we've talked about nearshoring, and it sort of made me chuckle because Arizona is not known for water, right? And fabs require a lot of water, and I think that's one of the things you pointed out. Are there certain conditions, geographically, people should look for when they're picking places to put their fabs? Are there better places than Arizona? I mean, not that Arizona is a bad place, but if you need a lot of water, it's probably not the best place, right?
Yeah. So yeah. Well, and I'd go even bigger picture, as we're all thinking about where we're going to live in the future.
Mars.
About water.
Mars.
Mars.
Well, bad news, Nicolette. I don't think there's a lot of water in Mars.
I told you, Brian. Brian's the first one on that.
It's deep down. You got to dig deep.
Oddly enough, no, there's a ton of water in space. And you've got meteors and other objects up there that are just encrusted with miles of ice. So, so I think this whole question about where is the water going to be in the future is an open question, and we're already starting to see climate migration, especially in the agricultural, the communities that are heavily tied to agriculture. But with respect to fabs. So maybe I can pull back and touch on a couple of things about all of this. So current landscape, 85% of the global foundry capacity is in APAC these days. 65% of it's in Taiwan. I want to say 18%, something less than 20% is in South Korea. China is about 5% at this point. In terms of semiconductor sales, I think the latest number out of SIA is it's about 12% of global is from the U.S. And it wasn't that long ago. The U.S. was a third or more, right? So, and this is supply chain related. The landscape has changed significantly in recent history, and concentrated a lot of this in Asia. So the other big headline is that, and this is what we were talking about earlier, where people are becoming more aware of semiconductors, is, how many times have you heard somebody say semiconductors are the new oil? Right? Yeah. Semiconductor reserves are strategic. It's, those of us in the tech industry have known this for a long time. Semiconductors are key to future prosperity for an economy, et cetera. And all of a sudden, because of all the supply chain issues and everything else, we've become aware of just how vulnerable the U.S. has gotten, because we have been outsourcing like crazy. Yeah. Everything that involves manufacturing, including semiconductors. So, now the leaders in the process technology are, from a fab standpoint, it's TSMC, it's Samsung, so Taiwan and Korea. The leaders in the process equipment that are enabling that tend to be European, guys like ASML. So we've got this supply chain that we don't have any direct influence over. Our influence is the right word. You have influence, but control, especially, government control. So how do we deal with that, right? So in the new infrastructure bill, there's the CHIPS Act, which is earmarked $52 billion for semiconductor manufacturing expansion in the U.S. By the way, that's over 10 years. So, and I talked about, a new fab costing $15 billion. So, right. You do the math. $52 billion is a lot of money, but
that's 3.5 fabs.
I was just going to say, is that enough money?
Yeah.
But there
Yeah.
you go.
Well, and I'll talk to that in a second. I just read something with some really interesting stats about that. But so we've got 52 billion. Of that 52 billion, only 2 billion of it is actually deliberately earmarked for kind of legacy technology. So we're right back into kind of digging that hole deeper. But the thing I would say about all of that with respect to the U.S. is, first and foremost, this is critical. I mean, we need to catch up, and I think the leaders of our big technology companies all understand that, and even the leaders of the companies that are big consumers of semiconductors all understand that. I mean, what's the latest news out of Detroit that some of the car makers want to start building their own chips? Talk about a learning curve, right? That's it.
Yeah.
But how did we get here? So first, it's because we've just been slaves to this kind of supply chain that the genesis of it is now more than 50 years old, and it's all about optimizing for cost,
Right.
Not for resilience. And we've left it all to corporate America to handle. And so when you look at China for instance, what they're investing in their domestic semiconductor market is mind-blowing in terms of subsidies and grants and tax incentives. The numbers are massive, which is why that 5% foundry capacity today is going to double in no time and then double again. And China's made no secret about it. They want to be independent in terms of chip supply. So we could talk for a long time about how that's going to unfold, and that's not as easy to do as it sounds, of course. But Korea, Taiwan, even Europe is investing a lot more in supporting their domestic chip manufacturing than the 52 million that we're talking about, if that even happens. So I'm afraid that the lion's share of this, the financial burden, is going to fall to our companies, and I mean, we're the best in the world at this. So I don't think there's any reason to be pessimistic, but I do think we've got to be realistic about what we're up against, and about how important this is. I mean, this is critical, in my opinion, to the U.S. maintaining its primo position as a world leader and as a world innovator, right? So I wandered around a bit on that. Did I've lost sight of what my target was, Brian. Did I hit it?
Yeah, no. I think we were talking about geography too, and Fabs, which we touched on, like in the U.S., like and stuff like that. And we were just talking about if also there are other geographical locations in the U.S. where it makes sense to pick, is one better than the other? Like, is certain parts of the U.S. better to build a fab in than others?
So here's a weird answer for you.
Okay.
This becomes a non-question and a non-event when we get to the point that's coming where energy is basically limitless and virtually free. Because with energy, you can pull water from deep below the earth readily. You can convert salt water to fresh water, which takes a tremendous amount of energy. And you can turn deserts into forests, and you can provide all the fresh water you need to a semiconductor fab, regardless of where it's sitting. I mean, theoretically, it could be sitting on the Red Sea and have plenty of water. So, and this is another favorite theme of mine, which is technology. There's so much that's advancing and combining to create new markets, new products, new solution sets, and address things that are somewhat existential, like availability of water, and things that are going to have an outsized impact on quality of life for every single person on the planet.
Mhm.
So that how's that for a left field answer to your question?
So it's about getting energy in the right place
Right.
is what I'm getting.
Yeah, and getting it, and obviously that energy is not fossil fuel
Right.
based, right? I mean, that's so yesterday. It's not even funny. It's green energy. It's wind. It's solar. There's I don't know if you guys have been following. There's what's going on in nuclear fusion these days. All of a sudden that is on fire. I think this year the capital infusion, the private market capital infusion into private, not government, but private nuclear energy development companies is breached 250 million. I mean, I think that's more than all the money that's been put into it through its history from starting in the 90s, right? So there's a lot of reason to be optimistic that nuclear fusion in particular is going to be scalable and viable by, I'm hearing 2030, which means 2035. The way things go,
Right.
And that'll be here before you know it, and that's incredibly important. But in the meantime, when you look at, here's another kind of exponential way marker, and I've got tons of them. I mean, I have loads of examples of how the world in technology in particular is advancing exponentially. But when you look at what's going on with the cost per watt of power from solar, it was like $100 in 1975, and it's less than 20 cents today. I mean, that's like a 500x reduction. And it's now, solar is cheaper than fossil, right? So, I mean, and I've talked about this in the past. It's high time we upgraded our grid. We put grid level storage in place that makes solar and wind power very feasible at a grid level. What's really cool about all of this is the technology's here. It's proven. It's come down the cost curve. It's in some cases, what's missing is just a little push from government to get it moving up into the right fast. But that's happening, and we absolutely in this decade are going to have everything we need to be fossil fuel independent. Electric motors, green energy sources of electricity, et cetera, et cetera.
And I know you've talked about the sixth wave, right, being environmentally friendly technology. This is what we're talking about here, right here, what we're talking about now, and going into that, correct?
It is. That's a big piece of it, and it also ties that this sixth wave is, and I'm going to get beat up for saying this, but I think it's a reference that everybody will understand. It's the Star Trek days, right? I mean, when you think about Star Trek and how they live and how the economies work and what they do and all of that, it's all part and parcel. It's it's related to this idea of infinite, basically free energy, and how transformative that is. And it's related to the idea of we're living longer and healthier, and it just goes on and on to the point where the sixth wave is, in many respects, it's science fiction, but that science fiction is becoming reality at a faster and faster pace because the adoption cycle of new technology is accelerating at a faster and faster rate. I was reading something recently about this, and it was an interesting chart. The book was by Azim. God, I don't recall Azim's last name, but he's written a book that's called actually, I think he's called exponential technology or the exponential age or something. And he had this chart about technology adoption. It was really interesting. So it took 50 years or more in the US for things like the telephone to reach like a 70 or 80% market penetration. It's taken less than 10 years for smartphones, social media, etc., to reach market penetration. I think you're going to see, that significant market penetration. You're seeing significant market penetration accelerating for things like electric vehicles. What's holding that back now is availability of chargers, because some of the other things that we were anxious about, range, etc., have been addressed. That the new vehicles have over 500 miles on a charge, and cost is coming down. The cost curve for the battery technology is coming down at an inverse exponential rate, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got all of this stuff happening. It's happening faster, and what that means is I think we get to the future faster. The ground that we would have covered in 30 years, we're now covering in 10, and tomorrow we're going to cover it in 5. And by the way, there's another exponential curve implied in all of that. So I think the fifth wave, we're solidly in the fourth industrial mm-hmm. revolution. We're going to get to the fifth and the sixth much faster than we move from the third to the fourth. Right?
Yeah, well, absolutely.
So I have a question about purchasing, because we were actually talking with our friends at Mauser about the future of purchasing a couple of months ago, and we were talking about technology, immersive technology, and virtual prototyping and whatnot. And I started to think about all of the ways that we could reinvent purchasing for the engineer or the procurement professional, whoever it might be. And we just wanted to get your take on how futuristic the purchasing environment could potentially be, and how it could change distribution.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things, honestly, that I'm obsessing on in this area. So first and foremost is, there's this broader concept of digitization, right? And of course, that has an enormous bearing on this topic. And everything is digitizing fast. Look what we're doing, right? It's all around us, and mm-hmm. the common wisdom is the faster you can digitize, the better you differentiate yourself, the more relevant you are, etc. And obviously, the supply chain has digitized, but it's kind of stalled. And there's this vision of the supply chain that's kind of frictionless, and it's connected, and the signals are moving up and down digitally. Straight back to the mine where the raw materials are coming out. What that vision fails to address is that supply chain information is proprietary. Who we buy from, what we buy, the exact formulas of the stuff we buy, all of that is proprietary. And because it's proprietary, we're not going to be super anxious to just, throw open the kimono and let somebody connect a cable in there and, grab our data and contribute it to the betterment of the global supply chain. So we've got to solve for that. And I think technologies like blockchain have a big role to play in that. So that's one part of it that I think is a stumbling block. The other part of it, and this is something I've really become obsessive about lately, is that, so I've talked a lot about how technology is advancing exponentially. Well, biology advances in a linear fashion. And And being the products of biology, we think in a linear fashion, and we plan in a linear fashion. And when we're talking about adding capacity and making investments in capacity expansion, we're thinking in a linear fashion. And when we look backwards in history in terms of growth rates or anything else, what we see is a linear curve, right? So the secret is evolving our supply chains such that they actually support with and are sensitized to how the world's moving forward. And this applies to your question, Nicolette, about purchasing. As long as we're planning for materials and everything else, using the same logic, the same playbook that we've used for, in essence, the last 50 years, guess what? This thing never gets, the kind of liftoff that it needs to break orbit, right? To break through into a new orbit. It just that's the big challenge right now. And the supply chain and the purchasing community, I mean, it's killing the purchasing community. And it's, the purchasing community is really dependent upon the manufacturers of all this stuff, the miners of the materials, the regulators of all the laws and things that pertain to this, waking up and starting to think exponentially, and leaving behind kind of the linear approach that we've had historically to the world. And it's hard to do because when you look at so I talked about the big growth in 2021. I guarantee you, most people are thinking about that as an anomaly. It's a one-off. It's not the start of a new pattern. Most people, not all people, but most people. And they're going to see plenty of evidence of that, because what they're going to see over a 5-year period of time is, I know it's going to be what looks like a linear curve. Now, the linear curve is going to be steeper at a steeper ascension rate than the prior linear curve. But it makes sense because the supply chains today are not able to support an exponential curve. So to unlock exponential, we're going to have a leap of faith and all get on the same page about what's really going on with demand and start investing exponentially. So, I think last week there was an article in the Wall Street Journal. They were interviewing some Dubai guy, some guy from Dubai. That kind of sounds like a song title from the B-52s, doesn't it? Guy from Dubai who's investing heavily in global foundries or something. And this is the Wall Street Journal. He's talking about how bullish he is on the future and why he's putting billions into this, and how he thinks it's not enough, that whatever's being put in place today is going to get soaked up fast, and then we'll be right back at this situation we're in, which is demand is vastly exceeding supply. So this is very tough for the purchasing community, and the purchasing communities got their kind of hands tied until we all get on the same page.
Do you think also another, something you made me think about, right? Because we're biological beings and we're thinking in that linear pattern. Do you think the labor shortage also needs a different thinking, right? In terms of how we ramp up automation versus us being biological creatures and going in that linear pattern also?
I do. I mean, so pre-pandemic, could any of us have imagined what would be going on in the labor markets right now? After the 2008 crash, we were hyper fixated for, more than 10 years on just how slow the job rebound was. And it wasn't that long ago, the key theme in national elections was, losing jobs to foreign countries and all the rest of it, right? And now all we're talking about is we can't get enough people. I'm back to traveling a ton. And so I'm in airports a lot. And you know what I'm finding? Things like McDonald's, Starbucks that are closed during the peak hours in the airport because they can't get enough labor to staff all of their locations in the airport, like here in DFW. So they might just staff one per terminal. And of course, there's like really long queues. It's all labor related. So yeah, part of this, so there's a couple of things. First and foremost, and this is probably going to really raise some hackles, but this is overdue. I remember back in the late 90s, there was a lot of buzz about any minute things were going to flip. The balance of power between management, and companies and labor was going to flip, and there were going to be labor shortages, and real wages were going to start going up, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, it didn't happen. It didn't happen, but bam, fast forward 20 years, that's exactly what's happening. When you think about what's gone on with real wage rates relative to inflation, they've been stuck for a long time, especially, in the service sector and the manufacturing sector. And so the longer they're stuck, the tighter that band gets stretched, the sharper the snapback that inevitably occurs. And that's what's going on today. But for technology, this is really important because I think part of what you're alluding to, Brian, is automation.
Yeah.
And I think we've got long-term labor issues. Now, it's not evenly applied. And by the way, I also think it's being, in a way, not exaggerated, but incorrectly emphasized. So we talked, what was it in September? 4.4 million jobs in the U.S., or 4.4 million people quit their job in the U.S. And then there was another, not as many, but another big wad of people that walked in October. When you think about the size of the U.S. workforce, though, you realize what we're talking about is something less than 5%. Mm-hmm. So, which means that something more than 95% of the workforce is stayed right where they're at. But this has spooked us, and it's put some power back in the hands of labor, and we're all going to have to deal with that. But in the long run, we're all, in one form or another, if we work, we're labor, right? What you have to think about is it's created increased economic incentives for companies to automate. And I'm not just talking about the traditional approach to automation, which is let's automate the factory. Right. Let's take the people out of the manufacturing process. I'm talking about using robotic process automation in combination with artificial intelligence to automate accounting functions, to automate call centers, et cetera, et cetera. And then using new technology to automate transportation, long haul trucks. Mm-hmm. Right. And one of the things that talked about is not enough truck drivers. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually not quite sure that that's really the case. I think we have not enough truck drivers for the current pay and expectations of truck driving. If what it meant to drive a truck in terms of personal health and wealth was better, I think you probably have a lot of truck drivers, right? But even there, what we're not going to have enough of is trucks for the drivers to drive. And we're not going to have enough containers to haul all this stuff around. But from a labor standpoint, this is going to be really interesting. I think the longer this goes on, the more automation we're going to see. And unfortunately, I think that we're going to see a widening of the gap between, the upper tier of society and the lower tier of society. So what I am very, and this takes me back to my Star Trek colored glasses. I do think we have the technology that we can continue to significantly enhance the quality of life for everybody, regardless of your tier. Mm-hmm. So, if being in the bottom tier still gives you a lifestyle that today is kind of like being a millionaire, then being in the bottom tiers, not so bad, right? So, and the thing I worry about, though, and I realize I'm down in a rat hole at the moment, but is that what that does to incentives and initiative, right? I mean, one of the things that drives innovation is this idea that you can catapult yourself into the upper tier of whatever, become a 1%er through hard work and clever ideas. That's the kind of what we call the part of the American dream, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can no longer do that because your gains are, taxed exorbitantly, or there's some other thing that's pulling you back, or redistributing the upside that you've created, then does it start to throttle back your innovation engine? I don't know. I'm a little worried about that. Although I do also think that maybe that the worry could be maybe is overpronounced, in that people who have that kind of engine, that creative engine, they're not gonna switch it off,
right? Yeah.
Because they can't get these outsized home runs. I mean, it's who they are, right? It's in your wiring. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, but it's sorry for this long rambling answer, because I do think it's all related. There's a technology thread through all of this, and I think it's exciting as hell. I mean, we're witnessing the birth of, I don't know what generation of our societal design we're on right now, but
what's interesting to me too is, as we're talking about automation, right? A lot of that automation involves electronics, right? And we're sort of at this, I don't want to say catch-22, maybe that's the wrong term, but we're sort of at this point where we have this labor shortage and we have this electronics shortage going on, but we need the electronics or the automation to counter the labor shortage. So it's a really interesting situation we're in right now, to say the least.
Yeah, and I thought about this a while ago. That very thing struck me, that we're really dependent upon ASML to crank out the photolithography tools and equipment necessary for these new fabs. Well, in order to build that equipment, they need semiconductors, right? So if the semiconductor supply chain doesn't prioritize ASML, it slows down the installation of new capacity. So it is all related, there's definitely, this thing is replete with catch-22s.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, is there anything else you wanted to talk to Michael about today?
I don't know. Didn't I ask enough questions already?
How about you, Michael? Is there anything we should have asked, but we didn't?
We covered a lot, and a lot of these are really broad subjects that you could talk about a lot. So hopefully, I've planted some seeds and contributed to this notion of starting to think differently about what's going on, and starting to think about the need to think differently in order to solve the problems that we have today, that yesterday's thinking, yesterday's playbook isn't going to win the game. But also, I hope I've come across with this notion that, these are really exciting times, hard times, but exciting times. I really do think we're at this, I've in the past talked about the 2020s being, the roaring 2020s, and I know lots of people are doing this now, making the analogy between what happened in the 1920s and the 2020s, and that there are definitely a lot of parallels, including the pandemic, right? The pandemic played a factor in the 1920s, the Spanish flu. But I think this is exciting as hell. This is a great time to be alive and a human being, not for all living humans, and that needs to get addressed. But more and more, more and more people are coming out of poverty. I guess the last thing I'll say, since you opened the door for me, Nicolette, is I am very concerned about also this trend towards nationalism and isolationism versus globalism. And globalism is not without its problems. I think globalism, in a way, has contributed to this kind of divide, right? But at the end of the day, people who trade together, people who work together, have common interests, and which keep them from going to war with each other. So I am a bit worried about that, and worried about geopolitical stability as countries get kind of hyper fixated on their borders and immigration and all the rest of it. So I think as a society, we also need to evolve at a faster rate. We've got to figure out how to get our institutions and our norms to move exponentially in order to enable all this. And if we can do that, maybe in our lifetime, we'll have cocktails on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, right?
Right. Let's do it.
Brian's there.
I'm there. Well then.
Well, thank you, Michael. We really appreciate this conversation every year. We look forward to it. We thank you for your time.
And I appreciate the opportunity to outgas. You guys are very patient with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.